Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you all had a chance to grab some coffee, a glass of water, a snack while listening to Dr. Elsa Wee's wonderful playlist. Thank you. That was beautiful. What an inspirational morning it already has been with Dr. Day's presentation. I will definitely be borrowing some of your terminology, such as academic warriors. Thank you, Dr. Day. That was really fantastic. Now, it is my great pleasure to be able to introduce our second guest of the day, Dr. Ainehi Edoro. Ainehi is an eminent figure in the world of African literature. She's known for her contributions as a scholar, as a writer, and as an editor. She's an assistant professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she teaches and researches African literature, political theory, and literature and social media. Beyond her academic accomplishments, Ainehi is perhaps best known as the founder and editor of Brittle Paper, which is a leading online platform that is dedicated to African writing and literary culture. Since its inception, Brittle Paper has become an indispensable resource which has fostered a dynamic community and has championed the voices of both emerging writers and established African writers. This platform, Brittle Paper, has facilitated critical dialogues about African culture and creativity in the digital age. Dr. Edoro's research interest is centered on the form, theory, history, and the culture of the novel as it emerged in Africa. Her current book project is titled Forest Imaginaries: How African Novels Think. She also writes essays and commentaries about contemporary African literary culture and mainstream publications such as The Guardian, Africa is a Country. And her recent publications include Achebe's Evil Forest, Space, Violence, and Order in Things Fall Apart. And this was published in the Journal of Postcolonial Inquiry. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Edoro here with us today. And just as the previous presentation, she'll be able to give a presentation and you will have the opportunity to engage her in a Q&A afterwards. And you can either, again, put in your questions now. So I encourage you to start writing your questions in the chat box if they pop into your head. And also, please feel free to unmute yourself. Dr. Edoro, are you here? Elsa, do we have Dr. Edoro here with us today?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Dr. Edoro.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah. Thank you, Elsa. Oh, we're so excited that you're able to join us. I hear there's a misunderstanding about time zones. Sorry about that.
No, it's completely my fault. I am on Central Time and I'm there tweaking my my PowerPoint. I'm so happy that Elsa called me. But yeah, apologies to everybody. I'm really very sorry.
Not a problem.
Welcome, Dr. Edoro. It's wonderful to have you here.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
We were able to jam a little bit more to the playlist, so I think
okay, cool. I heard it coming in. Those were confused.
Yeah, and Dr. Elsa, we had just shared the playlist also in the chat. So if anybody wants to take a look at it.
Okay, cool.
Dr. Edoro, we already actually introduced you. I have read your introduction. Okay. What I'll do is I'll paste it in to the chat one more time, but so that we can just continue in with our schedule, I'll have you jump right in if you have your presentation ready, okay, and we can just get going. It's exciting to have you here, and please, let's all welcome Dr. Ainehi Edoro.
Thank you very much. And then I know that I missed the check-in. Is it possible for me to be made a co-host so that I can share my slide?
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Weah will do that for
yes, you are co-host already, so you should
okay, all right, perfect.
be able to share it. Yep.
Excellent, wonderful. All right, great. So it's great to meet everybody. Thank you so much, Elsa, for inviting me to speak here today. Let me just get my timer going. So, all right, there we go. I feel really honored to be here. teaching is one of the most fulfilling part of what I do as an academic, and I'm always so just happy to talk about the things that I do in the classroom and things that work, things that don't, and ways that that could be helpful to us as a community. So today I'm going to talk about African literature in the classroom. And sorry, the slide looks rough because, you know, you're sort of getting the rough look. I didn't get the chance to kind of tighten things together and create a front cover and things like that. What I'm going to talk to you today is about my own experience of teaching African literature in like a Euro-American institutional setup. The challenges I've had and ways that I've tried to create a space where students can experience literature in a way that is immersive and that actually kind of helps them to encounter a rich representation of what it means to think about African writing. So I wanted to start with this quote from a study that was done a few years ago by Bhakti Sringapuri and Lily Saint. It was published on the publication Africa is a Country. The article was titled African Literature is a Country. To kind of poke fun at the ways in which in the North, we study African literature as if it is this kind of large monolithic thing. And their sense is that even though in the industry side of things, African literature seemed to be undergoing an unprecedented renaissance, you know, in institutions, African literature still seems very reductive, right? It's still very much centered on the 20th century. And we end up looking at only a kind of a handful of texts. So I'm going to share with you some of the slides that contains information that came out of their studies. They talked to
making the to launching the slideshow so that it's a little larger for everybody to see.
Sure, 1 second.
Thank you so much.
Does that work?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. So they found they talked to 250 professors over 1 year and looked at that hundreds of syllabi and figured out that and kind of found a few interesting observations about the way that we teach African literature in the US. One, it is very much focused on fiction, which is a broader African literature problem in the sense that modern African literature is much more skewed in favor of fiction. And there are industry reasons for this, there are historical reasons for this, but it is a problem in the sense that poetry, plays, for example, are overshadowed by fiction being this kind of dominant form that we teach. They also found out that in terms of countries that are represented in syllabi, South Africa and Nigeria kind of takes the cake, which again, if you know anything about the African literary space, even from the industry side of things, this tracks in the sense that Africa, Nigeria and South Africa is dominant in the literary sphere. And then the text, of course, this is not a surprise. Things Fall Apart is the highest in terms of texts that appear recurrently in syllabi. But what is also interesting is that Nervous Conditions, We Need New Names, and Americana are both by female writers, and two of those texts are very much more recent. They also saw that Achebe and Ongogi are the highest in terms of how frequently certain authors are taught. And again, lots of these data are not necessarily surprising. They track with what we imagine people are teaching in their courses. And what they came up with, right, is that their sense is that two key things, that comprising widely diverging percentages of curricula, it is nonetheless fair to say that in general, African literature constitutes a very small part of what students are offered in most Euro-American literature departments, and is rarely, if ever, required, right? In contrast, European and American literature is often specialized into regions, historical period, and single author courses. Undergraduates can enroll in medieval English literature, Renaissance literature. In fact, Renaissance literature could be further broken down into different kinds of units that explore different kinds of problematics within that context. So when you teach, at least when I teach African literature, one of my biggest challenge is that I am teaching a literature that students are possibly encountering the first time, one. Secondly, it's possible that my course could be the only place that they would ever encounter African literature in the course of their time in school, right? So that's even when I'm teaching an African literature course, which I teach. For some of you, you might be wanting to incorporate African literature into other kinds of courses. So you may actually even have a space for just one book, right? So how do you teach African literature in a context where you are sometimes having to introduce students to an entire archive, an entire continental archive, using one or two or three or four books, right? Which is vastly different from the way that our students are going to experience other kinds of Western canons, right? From when they were in high school, they've been inundated with Shakespeare. They are familiar with the form. They know the world, right? They've kind of existed within the language of Shakespeare. They get it. It's part of their sense of what the literary is. And then you're coming in and you're teaching this literary form that is, to start with, coming from a different world, that based on a kind of colonialist mentality of the world, they have probably been socialized to think of Africa as this very strange, exotic land or world. And now they're having to take a class in African literature or to read African literary text, but they don't have the chance to really immerse themselves in the archive, right? What do you do when all you have to introduce a text to student is a couple, an archive to student is a couple of texts? That for me has been one of the challenges that I've had. And I think that something that I have kept in mind, right, or rather a way that I've tried to kind of process what the problem is, right? Why do I find it difficult teaching African literature in American universities? What are the challenges that I face? And it has taken me a long time to kind of name what the challenges are, and so how I could kind of combat them. And I would kind of maybe I should start this section by telling you an experience I had right when I got out of graduate school. My first job, my first semester teaching at the university, I taught a course on African literature. And we read Things Fall Apart. And in the course of our discussions, a student raised up their hand and asked, is it normal for Nigerian men to kill their foster sons, right? If you know Things Fall Apart, you know that there is a moment where the lead character, Okonkwo, executes his foster son. And I became defensive, and I felt like, when I think back now, I felt like I made the student feel silly in my response, because I ended up saying something like, well, I mean, how would you think that Okonkwo killing his son in a fictional text is representative of what Nigerian men do as a whole, right? That, I mean, you've read American Psycho. Would it make sense for somebody to imagine that all American men kill women, right? I sort of gave, some type of what I think now as a defensive response. And thinking back now, if I had the chance, I would do over. Because what that student's question says is that it gestures towards a very fundamental problem with what African literature is in the institution. And that's the set of problems that I'm going to look at in the next set of slides, in the sense that that student was not being, how do I say it, ignorant, which is the way I read the student's question. The student was simply pointing to the fact that when we teach literature, we never take into account the fact that we are always teaching different kinds of literary objects. Teaching Shakespeare in a literature class is not the same thing as teaching Things Fall Apart in a literature class in an American institution. They are fundamentally two different kinds of literary objects. And I feel like we need to get that so that we can kind of figure out what's the best way of teaching this text. So for me, the first problem that student's question gestures towards is the fact that we are always having to teach from the point of through a representational canon, right? A representational canon for me is a collection of texts that are meant to do a lot more than they are supposed to do. Sorry, I think this thing is blocking everybody, right? Let's see. Okay, that's better. A representational canon, let me just see. Okay. A representational canon is a canon of literary text that is asked to do so much, right? So there are this set of texts we teach when we teach African literature in an institution here in the US. Africa is a massive continent with rich histories and just radical diversity, right? And yes, no canon is expected to represent the kind of exhaustive diversity of a literary context. But we are in a situation where we are teaching texts that students see as representative of the continent in many ways, right? And when we teach these texts, we teach them as if we are teaching just any literary text without taking into account the limitations of the text. That if I'm teaching Things Fall Apart in a class where students have literally hardly ever encountered African literature, where students are already kind of struggling with a whole set of misconceptions about African life and African world, then I need to kind of factor that into my teaching, right? To say, how can I teach in a way that presents Things Fall Apart outside of a canon that wants to reduce it to representing the entire gamut of African literature? In the sense that African literature within the context of a university here is a literature that is being asked to do way too much, right? And what does it mean to take that into account? The second thing is the idea of anthropologizing literature, right? This is something that I have written about, and I can put together a bibliography of articles for folks if anyone is interested, and send it out later. So I wrote this piece for The Guardian many years ago, right, where I talk about how when we teach African literature, we teach it as being either representative of the real world or a representation of the real world, right? So is this situation where literature as where African life and literary text kind of meld into one another, and it's hard to figure out where fiction begins and where real life ends. And you see this a lot. I have people send me emails to say, I am traveling to Uganda, for instance. Can you send me African novels to read so that I can understand Ugandan culture better? certainly reading the novel of a place that you're going to visit is perfectly fine. But the danger is it's easy for people to begin to see African fiction or literature as something that is the same thing as African life, right? And so that's where students begin to ask, well, is this novel really real life, right? In a way that they might not be inclined to ask if they were reading literature from the Western canon. Another thing which is connected to the idea of literature as anthropological text is the literature of social issues. Many people find it easy to teach African literature texts in relation to the social issue it illuminates for them. So they are going to teach about colonialism, about patriarchy, about environmental disasters, right? These are all things that we should teach, right? And these are all things that literature struggles with. But many times, our students end up only experiencing African literature as a representation or exploration of social issues, whereas they go into their Faulkner class and they can talk about the literary text, what it's doing. They can think about literature as a set of formal innovation, aesthetic innovation. But then when they get to the literary text, it's about, oh, it's representing a particular social ill, right? There's a way that it presents African texts as texts that are not contributing to the formal and aesthetic innovation of literature, but that texts that are just there to kind of to show us, how would I say it, to inform us about a particular political or social issues. And then lastly, there is a way that sometimes we teach African texts without properly universalizing it, right? So every text is particular, right? Shakespeare is the most particular thing you can imagine. It is of its time, right? It is a very text that comes out of a very specific historical, political, aesthetic context. But yet, Shakespeare, in spite of its being very provincial, like very unique and very particular to the UK, is a text that can travel very well and a text that we have no trouble universalizing. But see, we don't always give African texts the similar courtesy, because it's always, well, how does this text help us understand this particular situation? So that a student begins to think that, oh, African texts only apply to African worlds. They don't apply to my worlds. They don't apply to me, right? Are there ways that we can teach African literature in such a way that students can see how these texts are particular? Yes, we have to be able to historicize and contextualize texts, right? But we also, sorry, just looking at my time. But we also have to be able to help students figure out how to situate themselves in the text so that they see how those texts illuminate their own world and their own experiences and their own, imagination of literature and the world. Okay. So those for me are the kind of 4 key things: provincializing literature, literature as social ills, literature, anthropologizing literature, and the representational canon. Those are, I would say, the 4 problems that I have encountered in my teaching of African writing or African literature, right? And I have tried over the years to figure out a way to create a space where students can experience African literature differently. And I'm going to take you through a set of example, just one example of that. In the last 7 minutes, I'm going to kind of take you through how I do that in a course called African Feminist Writing. Now, again, I am very well aware that my students are coming into this course with a very uneven knowledge of what African literature is. I am very well aware that many of them are reading an African text for the first time. And I'm also aware that they will probably never encounter African literature beyond this class, right? So I have 3 months, about 15 weeks, to be able to kind of have them encounter African literature. What do I do? Okay. So the first thing I do is that I base the course on particular conventions, innovations, writing techniques. I present the course not as a course where you can come understand Africa or where you can come understand African literature, because it's not possible. I can't do that. But I say this is a course where you can come learn how to write in the ways that African feminist writers have written, right? These are women these are writers who have used writing to respond to very specific problems relating to patriarchy, right? I present patriarchy and feminism as problems of writing, right? So what are the strategies that these writers have used, and how can you model them, and what can you learn from them, right? So yes, the text is African feminist writing, but really the goal is for us to end that class becoming better writers, right? And so to start with, that kind of shifts the pressure of what the class is expected to do, right? So these are the kind of the collection of texts that forms the core syllabi. That's so. One of the things I do is that I want my students to leave that class experiencing African feminist writers working with words, right? How have these women contributed to the, what kinds of innovation have they brought to imagining feminist worlds and responding to patriarchy? And so I always begin my lecture with a quote from the text we are studying that week that is intriguing, right? Something that is sort of a brain tease that makes them think, right? Because again, for me, it's not so much the content of the text, but the way that the way that the writer is crafting their world. So I'll give you a quick example of the section on the Zimbabwean writer Yvonne Vera. So this is just a quick breakdown of the course. It's a large lecture course. So I lecture as opposed to teaching in a seminar style intimate setting. And then my TAs meet with students once a week for a more workshop type situation. So of course, I want to make sure that I situate my students in the context of the text. So we learn about Yvonne Vera, we learn about Zimbabwe, we learn about the history of Zimbabwe, because again, I think it is important to situate students in the specificity of the world that they are encountering. I don't want to erase that. These texts are fundamentally African texts, and we have to honor that, right? But then I also kind of introduce them to Vera's work more broadly, to say that this essay we are reading by Vera is not the only text that she's written. She's written a good body of text that you should be aware of, right? And then we kind of think about what Vera is doing with writing. Why is writing so personal, so sensuous, so emotional and centered on the body for somebody like Vera, right? And then we look at the text itself that we are assigned for the course. And then we end here, right? What we are taking from the course from this text is the ways in which Vera is literally trying to ask us to redefine what writing is. Writing is not just simply scribbling marks on a paper. Writing is something that begins from your body, begins from the way you sense the world, right? That's so here again, the goal is not to say, oh, Vera's texts represent Zimbabwean women's writing, but to say that Vera is a Zimbabwean writer whose text teaches us X and X things about writing, right? Who kind of helps us rethink very specific ideas about what writing is, how to define it, and how to use it. The second thing I'm going to kind of move on so that, okay. Let me talk about this. So I'm going to end on this point. And this has come out of the fact that, again, we are so limited in the space that we have to teach African literature for all kinds of institutional reasons, right? So my philosophy is that, sorry, this is actually not supposed to be here. This is from a different slide. Okay. That my sense is that it's difficult when we represent the African texts that we teach as representative, as the stopping point. If you want to know African literature, read ABC. For me, the text I share with students, how I teach, it's a starting point. So my goal as a teacher is to get you hooked on African literature so that beyond my class, you will want to explore it more. And I'm just going to quickly go through how I do this. One of the ways is that I make sure that I situate every author we are studying. I situate the text we are reading within their broader body of work, so that you don't think that Vera just fell from the sky, or she's this writer who has written just this one thing that we are studying, right? And so anytime I teach an author, I connect the text with other texts that they've taught, right? A person like Okorafor is a prolific writer, right? And it's important that students know that she is. And also, I find that the demographic of students I teach tend to be avid readers. They read a lot. And so I ask, who is interested in science fiction and fantasy? If you do, read Okorafor's work. And these are the texts to start with. This is where to go to find those texts. Follow her on Instagram. Follow her on, try to go beyond the text that we are studying and look at her and kind of figure out other ways to encounter her work, right? A few more examples. Another thing I do when I teach is that every week I give students a set of text that is inspired by something that we have discussed. So I have an "If You Love to Read" slide where students get to see things that they could look into if they wanted to explore the text further, right? So this is one of them. This is, for example, in the section where I teach queer African writing, I want to kind of make sure that students get a sense of other kinds of queer writing in the contemporary space. And one of the final projects of the course is for students to do an anthology. So 6 weeks before that course, that assignment is due, every week I share examples of African feminist anthologies. And so what this does is that even though I have only 1 semester to teach my students African literature, even though the syllabus can only contain 7 texts, by the time they are done, I have kind of showed them how to go seek out other kinds of texts. And I have kind of tried to curate other types of text in ways that speaks to interests that they might have in science fiction, in poetry, right? Whatever it is, so that the syllabus is just a starting point. And by the time you leave the class, you kind of have been immersed in a larger literary context that spans the syllabus, but also that extends into social media. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edoro. Thank you so much for an incredible presentation, for your perspective, for your insights, for your anecdotes, the stories that you have to tell about your experience in the classroom. These have been really, really useful, and being humble enough to see your role in this. I will want to, since we have some time, we do have about half an hour, so please, educators, write in your question. And if you do have something you want to say out loud, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. But in the meantime, write down your questions. Thank you so much. But we have about half an hour, so we have some time to delve into a more foundational question. And so what initially inspired you to this career and to literature? And what is that underlying, the fire that's underlying your passion to do this work?
Because I think that literature is ultimately a very unique space to ask questions about the world. And I think we are privileged, to be honest, to teach literature because it creates this space where students can interrogate, beliefs that have been calcified in their minds. Right? It's a very speculative space. And I'm not thinking speculative in terms of a genre. I think of literary text, especially fiction, for instance, as this sorry, I stutter, so I have to take a second to speak the word out. Mm-hmm. Literature, I think of as little laboratories, right? Where we can kind of see how world works and what kinds of questions to ask about world. So when I teach literature, I see it as an opportunity to kind of help students rethink things that may be deeply felt, right, in their experiences, and how to kind of shift the compass of their thinking. And I don't know, I feel like that is very, very special. And I love words. I think writing for me is a spiritual practice. I love to write. And I really want my students to connect with writing, to move away from seeing writing as an assignment for a paper. I want them to use writing to think through problems, think through questions, find their space in the world. And I love that I can show them how other people have used writing to do these things and how they themselves can do it. So yeah, I feel incredibly privileged to teach people how to write and how to study other people's writing.
That is such a beautiful response. I think it's inspiring because it puts the onus on the educator and the professor, the teachers, to sort of to take away the distance between the student and the work and self. So I think that's the most beautiful response I've heard about the interest in writing. There's lots of questions here, so let me see, and a lot of praise for you from lots of these educators here. I will begin by mentioning Eula Boyd's question. She says, thank you. I caught writing begins from the body. I caught that too. The way you sense the world. Can you recommend 2 pieces of literature that I can introduce to my high school Spanish students?
Okay. So these are students who will those be text translated in English or text in Spanish?
Eula, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hello.
Awesome. Well, whatever they catch, I will guide the process and I'll give them the language that they need to support their ideas after they read the literature, and then we'll put it in the target language.
Okay, great. So I would say one text to consider is Ainehi Okorafor's Broken Spaces and Outer Places, or Broken Places and Outer Spaces. It's very short. Students love it because, you know, she's kind of exploring how her experience with disability inspired her interest in becoming a science fiction writer. Essentially, how it helped her to kind of rethink these ways that we place value on bodies, how to kind of unthink the body as something that could even be broken, right? Because for her, being disabled is directly tied to how she became to, you know, to imagine worlds beyond what we consider to be real. It is very beautiful, small memoir, and I find that students connect with it a lot. I'll say that. And then I would say, if you want to be, like very militant and brave, one text you could consider is Mona El-Tahawi's 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls. So I'm giving you feminist text, but if you want text exploring other kinds of subject matter, email me and I'm happy to send you examples. But Mona El-Tahawi's 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls is a very militant feminist manifesto that does so many interesting things with writing as a feminist act that I think students like because it models for them how to write in ways that are powerful, but also clear and objective, but also very emotionally rich and layered.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a generous response. I have a question here from T. Clark about how you train your teaching assistants.
Okay, good. A very good question. Teaching assistants they are the real MVPs, I would tell you that. If you cannot teach a large lecture without teaching assistants who care, and because they are the ones on the ground. I come in twice a week. I stand there for 50 minutes. I give a lecture. I don't know many of my students personally. My teaching assistants are the ones who go there every week and interpret the assignments, the projects, and help students. Like, it's a lot of work. And so I say, one, I make things very clear to them. So for the 2 large lecture courses that I teach, I have an onboarding document that teaching assistants get when they come in that says, okay, this is what the course is. This is how you do it. These are suggestions for things. These are problems that we've had in the past, things like that. And then communication, open communication. You have to make a space where teaching assistants feel like they can express anything to you. They can express concerns. They can express issues. Some people don't like that. Some people are just like, I'm the prof. Don't talk to me about whether an assignment is working or not working. I'm not like that. Teaching assistants are resources. So I'm always thankful for the ways that they are always trying to help me figure out the course better. And then another thing is being clear about what you want in the class, right? Making it clear that that the students are in their charge and that they are responsible for what happens when they are there, but also making it clear that you are there to assist in any way. But I think going into it, understanding that TAs are not going to always know how to do what the course needs, and providing the guidance that they need is absolutely key.
And I think that sets the stage for how the class can go once you set that up.
Yes.
The expectations. That makes a lot of sense. Actually, somebody's asking, K-Coder is asking if you would be willing to share your onboarding documents for teaching assistants.
I will. I can share the one for I teach a social media writing course. I've taught it for about 5 years now. So that one, because it's so strange, it's a strange subject matter. And the English graduate students that work for me as TAs, it's sort of an unusual space for them to be in, we've developed a very robust onboarding document for them. I am happy to share that with folks.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Someone, Jen Garfield, is asking if you could say a little bit more about the anthology project that you have your students create at the end.
Okay. So the project is designed to have students take what the weekly writings that they've been doing and act as editors, right? So the way I think about it, this particular class has about 180 students. So over the semester, they've written 10 weekly responses to the text, right? So this is them taking African feminist writing and trying to process it through their own perspectives. So I ask students to get into groups of 4, and each group then acts as an editorial board where they have to take the 40 weekly writings among 4 of them, and they have to sit down and decide which of these writings do we want to include in the anthology. How much editing and revision do we need to do, right? And we prepare students through the process, right? What does it mean to be an editor of an anthology? And we also make it clear to students that anthology is a very feminist genre, right? That so this capacity to kind of collect women's writings about women's lives or the ways that they have impacted us is itself part of the project. And then over 6 weeks, they get to act as editors. And at the end of the day, they produce an anthology that is beautifully designed and that they get to present in their sections, and that the TAs also get to present during lectures for everybody to see. It's a project that I like because, one, in a world where everybody is worried about ChatGPT, it takes writing from content and makes students become editors, right? Have them to embody that role so that whether you used ChatGPT to write the initial response doesn't really matter, as now you have to sit down with three other people and make a ton of decisions about how we are going to go from 40 rough weekly responses to about 20 polished texts in a beautifully designed anthology. That process to me is what's more important.
That's a fantastic approach, because I think it addresses some of those limitations that you were talking about before, you know, in terms of looking at multiple works, like the provincialization, but also just understanding everything in context or situating. So I love that you're actually making them practice that in some way on their. That's wonderful.
Right, and I think that like you said, it's tied to how to make the students see these writings as connected to their lives, right? So we study things like Zimbabwean Shona idea of ancestrality. So we study things that are very much coming from indigenous African cosmologies. But by the time we are done, students are just like, okay, well, this idea illuminates aspects of my life, right? These are things that I can relate to, you know, and for me, my goal is to do that arc where, yes, you understand the specificity of this concept, but then we can kind of expand to the point where students can say, okay, well, this idea actually illuminates aspects of my own experience. And I think it's important that we can give students the tools they need to do that type of work.
That's great. That's really great. Let me get to some more questions. How do you teach theory involved, if any, and how much time would you dedicate to theory?
So, I mean, theory to me, you know, people understand theory differently. In a class like this, I think different courses, again, require different ideas of theory. For this particular class, theory, for instance, to me is, I'm going to teach Akwaeke Emezi's memoir, right? So they are a trans writer from Nigeria with connections to South Asia. And they write about their trans experience, but using Igbo cosmology, right? Using the concept of the Ogbanji. So now, for me to teach that text, I need to be able to take students to what I think of as the theory, which is the theory of the Ogbanji. This idea that human beings that certain human beings are not human. They have these cosmological ties to other worlds. What I do is that I have to kind of, first of all, situate students within that archive. So we spend a whole class learning about Igbo cosmology, right? We read Christy Achebe's book on the phenomenon of the Ogbanji. And we think about Igbo cosmology. I come to class with a diagram. You know, this is where the spirits live. This is where the ancestors live. This is the evil forest. So that this is the kind of diagrammatic structure that grounds the world that this writer is imagining from. So I do think that work of giving students the theory that they need, the foundations that they need, is very important, and especially within an African literature context, right? Where students literally don't know these things, you know. I think that it's important to do that theoretical groundwork before you then begin to show them how to navigate this text. I don't know if that answers your question, or if you were thinking of theory in like a Judith Butler sense or something like that. For me, theory is, okay, all right, good.
Yes, Clark. Okay, you could see her actually. Okay, great. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Clark, for that question. Another great question that I see here is that from Rhonda. And she says, you state that writing is a spiritual practice. How do you view spoken word or poetry as a form of art and expression? And do you use it in your course? You did mention that you think that these are overlooked in literature classes.
So, I mean, my training is in fiction, and I am part of that stereotype of the literature professor who teaches only fiction, you know? And it's something that I am trying and working hard to get better at. So I honestly wish that I could do more with poetry specifically, because again, especially with this course where we're thinking about feminist writing, there's a way that poetry itself is such a powerful, medium that feminist writers have used. And so I do feature poetry. I feature Wasan Shire's Teaching Your Mother to Give Birth. I think that's the title. But I don't center spoken word poetry. It's something that I would love to explore more, and even not just from a syllabus perspective, right? Just as I try to teach students to write from a different place, is there a way to teach students to speak, to teach them how to speak truths, right? And then again, especially in a world where we are concerned about ChatGPT, is teaching students how to think with speaking a way that we can open up, new pedagogical possibilities. But that's a brilliant question, and I'll definitely keep it in mind.
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you. Yokabet Gideon is asking how you decide which works and which authors to teach, since it's so broad. And would you please show the list of countries that you usually covered? I guess that was part of the presentation. Yokabet, if you would like to expound on your question a little bit more, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, I was talking about the list that was shared at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. See. This list, right? This one?
I think it was the one with the
It was
country.
at the very beginning,
Yeah, this one probably. Yeah.
Okay, this one.
like earlier, yeah.
Okay, this.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I would say if we look at, these are the core texts, right, that I teach.
Mhm.
And so this is Zimbabwean, Nigerian, Egyptian, Nigerian. Then I usually include like 2 or 3 texts from the Black diaspora. So this is Nigeria, sorry, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Egypt, Nigeria, US, Zimbabwe, Sudan, by way of Kenya and the UK, Nigeria, Nigeria, US, Nigeria. So again, you can see that that Nigeria certainly, takes the cake in terms of texts, of the most texts that are taught. So I mean, that is pretty common, and a challenge will be, how can I infuse as much diversity as I can in the text, right? Because the moment you say diversity is important to me, right, it has to be done in such a way that it does not take away from what the texts are actually doing. And I think the perfect, or the kind of the generative space for me is where a text has broad representation, where a syllabus has broad representation, but each book is there for a reason, not just because they are from X country. Because students can see through the kind of just checking diversity box approach to creating a syllabus. Why is the text there? Is it just because it is from X place, or is the text doing something that is helping us, is doing something specific to the course itself? And I think that that's where I struggle most, and where I think that we urgently need to kind of find ways to curate text in such a way that it represents a broad range of countries, but is done in such a way that it feels organic to the course itself.
Has it taken you a long time to evolve the way you teach? Was there like core moments that you realized like this is not working and I have to adjust outside of the story you told us at the beginning? But I just see that there's so many layers in the way you teach, from going to specific to broad, and the dance that you do in between. And was there something, a specific story that really, impacted you in the way you evolved, or has it just been over the time that you've taught, learning as it went along?
I would say it's just kind of frustration from watching students struggle with African texts in ways that didn't feel like it was helping them. I would get like weekly responses with students writing about an African literary text, and just what they would say would just it just seems so. It seemed so, they were clearly not engaging with the text. They were simply regurgitating stereotypes that they may have about the continent. They will speak in very broad terms about, African women, are oppressed, they would, I got to a point where I got tired of reading students analyze, non-Western texts, African texts differently from they will do Western texts. Because I also teach a course called Feminist Futures. It's a broad feminist course that is focused on feminist speculative fiction, and there's everything there. American fiction, British fiction, everything is in there. So I see the way students respond to those texts. But then when it comes to African literary texts, just the things that they say. So had to step back instead of always saying, oh, my students are ignorant. Oh, my students have colonial mentality. Like, I don't know. I just got tired of making the problem so ideological and saying, but what if students literally do not have the tools to look at this text, to unpack them in a way that is meaningful? And why am I assuming that an African literary object is going to be like, why am I teaching Achebe like I'm teaching Shakespeare? They're completely different discursive context. And I think the moment I shifted from that view and said, okay, my focus is going to be what are strategies I can use to be able to open up these texts so that when my students open up a text, they are not seeing some kind of like Africa that is, kind of filtered through the prejudices that they have, but they are seeing a beautiful text, a lovely text that is gorgeous, that is doing interesting things, right? But that is also solidly African, right? I never want to lose sight of that. That's very important, but I don't know. It was just a way to make my student write more interestingly so that, I can have better papers to read.
Well, your class sounds very, very dynamic. I have a question that's interesting here. How do you write your learning outcomes? Have you had any resistance from administration about this type of course?
So no, my department has a set of stock learning outcomes, and then they are very happy and encourage you to kind of tweak it as much as you can, but make sure that you kind of stick to the spirit of the kind of the guidelines that they have. So I designed my own learning outcomes very specifically to the course. And then this course, is about 180 students, and it fills up in about 2 days. It fills up very fast. There is so much demand for the course. And I think that there are lots of other reasons for it, given the climate that we're in. I think that students are just hungry, to take courses that helps them to think differently. But my department administrators love classes that fill up, because filled up classes means money for them. So they're not worried about the content of the course or the bent of the course. They are just happy that that it's that students appreciate the course and that it gets people through the door.
Mm-hmm. Do you teach any works by women elsewhere in the New World diaspora? Kathleen Phillips, would you like to expound on that question? And no, do you teach any works by women elsewhere in the New diaspora?
So I teach courses mainly in the US diaspora. I don't teach, I don't have Caribbean feminist writers in my course. And it's partly due to kind of the limitations of my exploration as a reader, and it's something that I want to explore more. But because I live in the US, there's a way that it's kind of the diaspora world that is most present to me. And that's so I find that it's easier for me to make conversations between feminists within the continent and feminists here. But I think that I've been thinking a lot about kind of expanding what Black feminist literatures mean and what it would look like to actually even create a course where I just have these women in conversation with one another. But yeah, that's something that I'm definitely open to. And there's someone here John Omoniyi Omalabi, who I think
Yes.
um
He asks, how can the teaching of African literature be related to environmental management, landscape horticulture, and floriculture? And that actually, draws to a question that I had about addressing social ills, because that is a difficulty, because of course all of us will do that in some way. And literature, it does that quite well, but you mentioned the challenges of it not being representational. How do you find that balance of being able to address this, but still, being not trying to be representational of everything?
I think that for me, simply, it's my belief about literature is that literature is first and foremost a set of it's first and foremost aesthetic and formal conventions before it is another thing, right? So, for example, in my own work, I study forests, the representation of forests in African literature, right? The way I study literature is to say, okay, writers are always trying to, they are thinking about a problem. Actually, it's not that they are thinking about, writers write for all kinds of different reasons. But the kind of hypothetical writer in my mind, right, is a writer who is like, okay, I want to critique colonialism, right? Colonialism presents a set of problematics. Colonialism is a system that is very abstract, right? It's hard to wrap your head around the violence that colonialism represents. For this question, it could be the violence of the environment, right? We are struggling today to communicate to people why the fact that climate change is happening, because for some reason they can't grapple with it. So a novelist might write a story, right, that explores climate change. But what I am interested in is not just the fact that they are critiquing or that they are representing climate change, but I'm interested in how they are doing it. What aesthetic and formal strategies are they mobilizing in order to represent X or explore X? And for me, that is where exploring social ills has to intersect with analyzing formal and aesthetic conventions in a text, right? So that the text does not just become, oh, it is important because it represents, but how does it represent? What is unique and interesting about how it is building its fictional world? Because the moment we go there, then we are still talking about social issues, but we are now bringing it into literary questions about form, aesthetics, and things like that. And I find it that sometimes we don't make that journey all the way through. We stop at, oh, this text represents polygamy, and that's it, right? And I just think that is not enough to say that a text represents social ills, that we need to do the text justice. We have to be able to show what is interesting about the strategies that the text is using to do this particular thing, right? And that to me is where you kind of, bring both problematics together, and students can see how this text is innovative. And it's not just that, oh, the text represents X. Is that, no. The text is thinking in ways that are interesting, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I thought that was a fantastic answer. I know we are already pushing the time, so I think we've come to the end of this. And unfortunately, we didn't even have a chance to really kind of discuss or talk about brittle paper. I think Dr. Elsawiya put the link into the chat. So since we don't have time to go over some of these questions that I really would have loved to be able to ask about that, please, I would invite everybody to just visit the site and just look at all this work that she's done. It's very innovative, it's creative, it's a platform, and we're all very grateful that you have started this. And in general, this presentation has been so passionate and enlivening, and I think we all would love to just be in your classroom. You've taught us so many models that we can use and apply to ourselves and put some fire to our feet as well. I'm really grateful for that. Thank you so much, Dr. Edoro. This was wonderful. And I hope we get a chance to discuss this with you again.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me here. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. And Professor Yugi, I appreciate, you know, your having you as an interlocutor. Thank you so much. Elsa and the team, Raj, thank you so much. It's been great.
I just want to add something. Yours was a very unique presentation in that you not only talked about content, but also talked about approaches.
Yes.
Most of the presenters, I don't want to name people, but people do an excellent job of content. But what is very helpful, especially for faculty members at teaching colleges and universities, is illustrations, comparisons, approaches, techniques, methods, and so on and so forth. And on behalf of the consortium, I would like to thank you. And I also want to thank you for keeping the fine balance between content and approaches and methods and techniques. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really
I
appreciate it.
also want to add my appreciation for your presentation, which was really, really very informative and fun to listen to as well, but also really inspiring. Really, thank you so much. And I want to let our faculty from different places know that her presentation, as well as others, is going to be available for you. And all the questions that you ask, you know, she's going to make available some of the questions and some responses to that. So stick around, come back after lunch. Thank you so much.